Hi, my name is Eric Worrell, and in this video series, we're going to be doing a full comprehensive tutorial on endurance cycling. How do you prepare for a long distance race, whether it be a century ride or perhaps something similar to what I did, a 7-day, 546-mile ride called the Empire State Ride? So the first few things that you should know about me before we get into this video series is that I am not an expert cyclist, but I do know one. His name is Charlie Livermore. You can see him on the screen right now. I'm going to be bringing Charlie in on the next video, but I didn't want to embarrass him in the live interview and talk about all his accolades. Charlie is a legit cycling coach. He has trained USA Olympic athletes. He has been in the business for 30 years. So I met Charlie on the Empire State Ride, and throughout the course of that ride, he would give talks in the evening and start explaining about, mental preparation or different things you should be doing on your bike as you're riding and how you're supposed to think and how you're going to attack a hill. And he would give us all these great tips. And I learned so much from Charlie over the course of the week. And I remember thinking, I wish I met this guy. I wish I knew who he was before I did this endurance ride. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and take as much information as I can from Charlie and condense it down into this video series for you. The next video is probably the one you really, really want to watch. That's the one that's going to include the training plan. We'll have a free link to that training plan so you can access it. And Charlie's going to go over step by step on how exactly you should train for an endurance ride, whether it be a century ride or maybe something similar to the Empire State Ride where it's 7 days, 546 miles. And lastly, I'll tell you from experience, take the time to go through this training. I wish I had a resource like this before I went out. I enjoyed the Empire State Ride tremendously, but I definitely had to gut it out some days to be able to get through it. And there was other people who were really enjoying themselves because they weren't just completely gassed at the end of the day. So follow Charlie's advice, go through this series, and definitely take the free training plan and apply it to your training needs. The last thing I will say, though, is if you are planning on doing an endurance ride, it's a good idea to probably talk with a doctor just to make sure that your body is capable and up for the task. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to the next video with Charlie. Hey, Charlie, thank you so much for joining me for this video. So I know as somebody who has gone from a complete novice rider, like to the point of falling over on my bike, not being able to clip in the spring, to doing a 500-mile ride, that getting the insights that you can provide in this video would have been so helpful. So I really appreciate your time because I think this is going to be really helpful for the people watching this who maybe feel that anxiety of a big ride that they want to, attack, but they're not sure how to get started, what they should be doing. So I can't thank you enough for being on this video.
Oh, my pleasure to be here, Eric. And I remember that year too, that when you weren't so prepared, you definitely suffered. And the funny thing is, you got through it. Mm-hmm. You actually did it, but you didn't enjoy it as much. And, when you got to camp, I remember a couple of days, you were just completely wasted. And you can avoid that with what we're about to do here, and it's like talk about the training and preparing for it.
Absolutely. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going over a training plan, but also talking about nutrition and mindset and just everything together that you really need to be considering when you're attacking a long distance ride that's hopefully not a few weeks away, but you've got some time to train for and be ready for. So, Charlie, what we're looking at right now is a training schedule that you created for this 7-day ride that goes over 500 miles. I know one of the first things you talked about was that this doesn't necessarily apply just to a multi-day ride. This can apply to different types of long distance riding. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, this definitely will prepare you for the Empire State Ride and a multi-day ride. But, if you do this training plan, you'll also be well prepared for a single-day century ride. So the preparation is similar. The big difference really is in between those two types of events is, how you ride the event itself. Once you get there on a one-day ride, you can leave it all out there and you can make some mistakes, some nutrition mistakes. You can do things because the next day is a rest day. You don't have to be on your bike. But when you're doing a multi-day ride, you really got to pay attention to what you're doing because tomorrow's another day.
Okay. One of the things on this training plan that you have here, and we have a bunch of free resources we can share, and the description of this video will have a link to it, is you've kind of created a little bit of a vocabulary and forgive me, is this kind of industry standard, or is this something that at Carmichael Training Systems that you guys have developed, or when you're talking about recovery miles, endurance miles, tempo, and all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is Carmichael Training Systems specific zones, and this is the way that Carmichael Training Systems describes the zones. It's not very different than other coaching companies or other physiologists would say it might be zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. Some people call steady state threshold, tempo sub threshold. So it really is just CTS nomenclature there.
Okay. So when somebody's looking through this, they can kind of quickly see that in the parentheses, there'll be different things explaining kind of essentially what zone that you would be in. So if it says T here, that means you're at tempo, you're at about a 7 out of 10 on effort, and uncomfortable conversation. I like the way that you guys have the talking ability written down here. It makes it pretty simple.
Yeah.
So if somebody is looking at this, what is the rationale behind this? Obviously, if you take a quick look, you can see that Mondays are completely rest days. Wednesdays, there's some rest on Fridays, and it kind of seems like it ramps up. I know it's not new for people, the idea that your body needs rest, but why is that so important if somebody's doing a long distance training?
Well, rest is in the recovery, and the rest period is where your body really adapts from the stress that you're putting on it during the workouts. Rest is super underrated. You have to make sure that, when you're doing the workouts, that you're actually doing them in a quality way, that you're not too tired. And so that's important for the rest as well. Riding 5 days a week is generally as much as people can do also. So, you have to think that this is a kind of a generic plan. And, I'm assuming that, people are going to be able to ride 5 days a week. Some people can ride more than that, but 5 days is plenty. And if you look at the kind of like the philosophy of this plan, and it's just one of the principles of endurance training, which is progression. So if you kind of look, everything progresses throughout the 22 weeks. For example, if you're looking at Thursday on, you have, 40 to 60 minutes of endurance miles, and then the next week it's 60 to 75 minutes. And then the next week it's 60 to 90 minutes. And then the following week, if you notice, it's a rest week. So we're doing it in blocks of training, blocks of 3 weeks at a time, where we progress the training, hopefully get you plenty fatigue, so that on the 4th week or at the end of the 3 week, you need a week of easy riding to kind of recover. And this is where the big adaptations actually come in. So it's basically 3 weeks of progression and drills and volume and intervals, followed by a week of nice and easy recovery rest to get you ready for the following 3 weeks. And so that's how it's built up. So for progression.
I feel like there were some things that you had mentioned where, as far as we talked before, you have like 3 by 6 minute, 4 by 5 minutes, 6 by 30 seconds. What do you mean by that? As far as like, you have one that says 60 minutes. I'm looking at one of my highlighted here, F6 here on that Thursday. It's 60 minutes EM. So I know that means endurance miles. It's about a 5 or 6 effort, but it says 2 by 10 T. So what does that 2 by 10 stand for on there?
So basically that ride means that the total ride time is going to be 60 minutes. And you're going to be riding in endurance miles, with the exception of 2 10-minute tempo intervals that you're going to do with 5 minutes recovery in between. So that's what it means. It means that the whole ride is 60 minutes. The intensity is endurance miles, with the exception of those 2 10-minute intervals that you're going to do at a little higher intensity, which is at tempo. So instead of a RP scale of 5 to 6, tempo, you're going to be more like 7, 7.5 on that.
So in that particular case, if you wanted to go from the 15 to the 25-minute mark, you ride 10 hard minutes, then you might have 5 minutes of recovery, and then you do another 10 minutes hard.
Exactly. And so let's say you rode, let's say you warmed up or you rode for 20 minutes and
Hmm.
you're riding at endurance miles, and all of a sudden you're going to do you choose when you're going to do your 2 by 10 minutes, and you do them together. You're going to go the first 10 minutes hard, recover 5 minutes, and then do another 10 minutes. And then the rest of the 60 minutes, whatever's left, you do it at endurance miles.
Okay. I'm just going to kind of go through here, see if there's anything else that kind of strikes me. Because I know for you, you could probably look at this thing and immediately know what everything says. But same thing over here. I mean, just to kind of repeat it again, same as far as endurance miles. So you're at that 5 or 6 effort level.
Hmm.
But you got a 3 by 8, and it says that it's SS. So that one's a steady state, as we can see down here.
Exactly.
Um,
Hmm.
so this is the same thing. So if I was to guess, you could be riding 20, 30 minutes on this one. And then that's when you'd start your 3 by 8 with the 4 minute breaks in between the 3 sessions where you're going hard for 8 minutes, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have you're going to do 8 minutes with 4 minutes recovery, 8 minutes for recovery 3 times. And then whatever's left of the 90 minutes is all that endurance miles. So you're going to ride easy the rest of the way.
Okay. When you're talking about like easy spin, right? Is that just basically usually on a stationary bike and you're just essentially getting your legs moving? Or, I mean, what
Yeah.
would you describe that as?
Yeah. That's active recovery. Basically, it's uh, you could almost call that's basically a recovery ride. 30 to 60 minutes is like, it's almost like riding to the coffee shop, having a coffee, riding back. It's active recovery. Instead of being completely, at rest, you're basically, riding a little bit, getting a little blood through the legs, and recovering actively instead of passively.
Okay. Just when I'm looking at this is one of the misconceptions that I had was if you are riding, and in my case, it was, going into this event that's 80-mile days. I am like, how am I ever going to train for this? Because I thought that I was going to have to ride 80-mile days, 5 days in a row, 6, 7 days in a row before this ride even happens to be like mentally and physically capable of doing this. From talking to you since then, I realized that's not the case. What's the general rule of thumb? Like, let's say somebody's training for a century ride. How many miles should they at least be able to get in before that ride starts?
You know, th- there's it really depends on the goal of the rider. And this is where, generic training plans, are built for, everybody who's going to do the Empire State Ride in this case. And as you know, there's, some pretty fast riders, and then there's some riders that are not very fast. So, some people are finishing it in, 6 hours in a day, and some people are taking 10 hours.
Hmm.
So the answer to your question, like on a century ride, if you want to go to a century ride and be in the first group and be there, and have your best performance ever, it's probably a good idea to do a century ride before it.
Okay.
And as maybe of a test, or maybe even a couple of century rides before it, depending on how well you want to, what's the time that you want to do, what's your goal. um, on the other hand, if you're a person who just wants to enjoy the day, get through it, you don't have any goals about time, you're not competing or anything, you want to do it, and you probably don't need to do more than 60 or 75 miles. You'll get through it on that day. You'll get that last 40 or that last 25. It's not optimal. I wouldn't recommend it, but it can be done. And I guess what I'm trying to point out is that, whether it's a century ride or an Empire State Ride, how you train is going to depend or I should say, let me back up. Your goals are going to dictate more how much or how hard you have to train.
Okay.
For the Empire State Ride, this particular training plan is made to get everybody across the line. It's not going
Hmm.
to make everybody incredibly fast, but what it's going to do, it's going to avoid kind of what happened to you in that first year, where you get through it and then you get to camp and you're so tired, you're so wasted, that all you can do is get in your tent and lay down.
Hmm.
And what's happening then is you're laying down, without all of the recovery protocols that we may, talk about, getting clean,
I got clean, Charlie. I cleaned after every day. Maybe I
well,
didn't stretch. Maybe I didn't, eat enough or, pay attention to my nutrition, but I cleaned.
yeah, but all of the really important pieces of recovery that you need to do as soon as you get off the bike,
Mhm.
and then there's the social aspect of it, and the better you feel, the more you're going to enjoy the post-ride activities as well.
Okay.
So I think that's what, when you talk about, to finish your question or answer your question, you know, your goals will dictate, how you really want to train. And then that's where one-on-one and personal coaching can be better for somebody who has a real goal for a hunt, for a century ride, like a performance goal, or even for an Empire State ride. I'm coaching two folks right now who have done it before, and their goals are to finish it a little faster so that they have a little more time at the end of the day, to enjoy the camping and enjoy, a little bit of yoga or whatever the activities are going on. And that's their goal. And so, they're training a little different than somebody that might be doing something that just wants to get them, through the event.
Okay. Question that I have, because we were talking about this earlier. We're both in colder climates right now. I'm out in Buffalo and you're out in Colorado.
Yeah.
What if somebody's watching this and they're in the same situation? What is your recommendation for them? They just can't get out on the bike outside. I mean, for me, before I got into this, I didn't even know anything about any kind of spin bikes or anything. Like, if somebody's just getting into it, what would you tell them?
Well, I mean, you have to train indoors, and so you have to either, buy a trainer and set it up in your basement, like I was today for, a couple hours, or you can, go to a gym that has some spin bikes or something like that. But basically, you're going to have to do the work indoors. If you notice, if you look at the schedule, and it's not up on the screen right now, but if you look at the schedule, you'll notice that, in the first months of this program, the most you're ever going to do is 2 hours. So you can see that, all the way through not until week 10 are you actually doing more than 2 hours. So everything that is on the first like 8 weeks should get you, it should be doable indoors,
Hmm.
because you can ride indoors up to 2 hours. At 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, that's a lot tougher to do indoors. And I think that by hopefully, uh, if you started this program right, 22 weeks away from the Empire State Ride, generally you're going to be fine by the time you get to 7 or 8 weeks. It's going to be outdoor riding.
As far as just like more so, physically training for this off the bike, we don't have to go too far into the weeds on that, but are there any basic exercises or parts of the body anatomy that people should be thinking about if they're just trying to like, hey, should I do some squats? Should I do some wall sits? Like what's going to be helpful if somebody's got time to dictate and dedicate to that?
Yeah, you can do some gym work, really simple. I mean, if you're doing strength or resistance training specifically for cycling, it's really only three exercises that you need to do that are specific. Squats that addresses the hip, um, the leg presses that addresses kind of the quads and the knee joint a little bit, and then leg curls, to address the flexion of the knee joint, and so basically that's all you need to do is those three exercises. The other thing that you should be doing is really doing a lot of core work. And of course, squats is going to help with that a little bit. It's going to make your core stronger. But core work is something you can do all the time, year round. But if you're going to do a period of resistance training, those three exercises are all you need to do. And then if you're going to do a resistance training program, you got to kind of like 10 to 12 weeks allocate about 10 to 12 weeks, because you got to go through a period of adaptation
Mhm.
where you're doing those exercises with very lightweight, just to make sure your form is really good. And then you're going to go through a short period of hypertrophy, which is the period where you're actually going to grow a little bit of muscle mass. And then after that period, you're going to go through a strength period where you're going to learn how to recruit that new muscle. And then finally, a little period of power where you're going to move you're going to move those, those joints very quickly using those exercises. And it's like power. It's like a lot of weight and a lot of speed through it as well. So that's
Okay.
kind of like the gist of a typical resistance training program for cyclists.
Okay. Last question on that is, if you, let's say you're looking at a 22-week training plan like this, does that like kind of tail off at a certain point because of the amount of cycling that you're going to be doing is increased, or like how does that work time frame wise into a training plan?
Yeah, that 12-week period is really specific and probably should be added to the beginning of the 22 weeks. You could probably get away with, doing some of those exercises twice a week in the first 4 weeks of the plan as it is, but it's best to really, just use that period for resistance training. And the bike part of that will be basically, sometime before, 30 minutes, let's say, before you do your exercises, and 30 minutes afterwards, after you do exercise. So you'll be doing about an hour of bike work and about an hour of gym work, probably even a little less than an hour of gym work. And that would be how you would, do the resistance training. And then of course, as you progress through those different types of strength and power phases, there are specific things that you want to do on the bike that supports that same type of movement. So when you're doing power, you'll be doing some sprints on the bike. So something that is, going to create a lot of power. When you're doing strength training, the strength portion of it, you're going to be doing some specific work on the bike that complements that as well.
Okay.
So it's not in the plan here, but again, this is where, one-on-one, this is where getting, having a coach, uh, can really customize things for you a lot more.
And the thing that I didn't realize from the first year of talking with you is that you can have a coach that lives across the world with the technology that's available. So some people might not be familiar with what are they called, like power pedals or power meters on your pedals, right?
Yeah, that's right. Everything coaching right now is like remote-based coaching is very, very popular. It's really the industry standard. And what we do is we basically take the data from whatever you have on your bike that is collecting data. It could be a power meter and a heart rate monitor, or it could be just a heart rate monitor, but you're also getting GPS information. You're getting cadence and speed, um, uh, all the intervals. You can see everything on coaching management software. And it's really incredible. The only thing you can't do is ride with the athlete. But for example, the two Empire State riders that I'm working with now, one lives in New Hampshire, and the other one lives in New York, is close to Buffalo, actually.
So one of the things that I want to talk about, because we kind of talked about this in another earlier part of this video, is nutrition and how
Mm.
important that is. And not only on the ride, but leading up to the ride, because that's going to be your fuel source for when you're on the bike. Let's say somebody has no idea about what they need to eat or what they're supposed to do if they're training for a century or one of these 7-day, 500-mile rides that we're talking about with the Empire State Ride. I mean, what would you tell that person if they said, "Hey, Charlie, like, what should I eat?"
Well, yeah.
Because I'm sure you
Well,
get those questions where you're like, "Oh, there's a lot to this."
there's a lot to that. There's a lot to that. But trying to condense all of that, down to it, is that you have to eat a certain amount of macronutrients that is equal to the amount of work that you're doing. So if you're riding for 1 hour, what you're going to eat and drink in that 1 hour is different than on the 4 hour a day rides. What you eat and drink on a 1 hour or an hour and a half easy endurance ride is going to be different than what you're going to eat on a hour and a half day where you're doing a bunch of intervals where the intensity is a lot higher.
Mhm.
And what really the difference is just the amount of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that you're going to eat for those different types of demands of training.
Mhm.
And I actually created a chart that I think that eventually we could put up, or it'll be on the Empire State Ride website, that has some real guidelines as to how many grams of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats to eat for a set given, volumes and distances and intensities along the way.
Let me stop you there. Because I know that this is a thing that I see: macronutrients, micronutrients. What do you mean by that, macro nutrients?
Macronutrients are essentially the ones that that are important to us is carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Those are the three macronutrients. Micronutrients are more kind of like all the enzymes and like all the real nutrition that's in the macronutrients. For example, uh, carbohydrates. If you're eating whole wheat or pasta, let's just say regular white pasta, it's the same amount of macronutrients that maybe whole wheat pasta or brown rice or potato can give. But all those other foods give you a lot more micronutrients in there that are really good for your health.
Mhm.
So what you want in the end is to eat really good, nutritious carbohydrates. So the macronutrients that has a lot of really good micronutrients in it.
Okay.
But the macronutrients, the chart that I'm talking about only speaks of those macronutrients.
Okay. As far as the day before, because I know it's a question that people say, you hear about like carb loading, and that there's probably a lot of different myths on that. I mean, what do you recommend to somebody? Let's say in this particular example, they have 100-mile ride the next day. What kind of preparation are you doing nutrition wise the days before?
Well, you said the right word there because it's days before. It's not the day before. And so, if you're going to do a 100-mile ride, the week before the ride, it should be, or maybe even 10 days before the ride, again, depending on your goals, should be a taper week. So in that taper week, as you get towards your event or the day before, you're going to make sure that you're loading with carbohydrates according to how you're training, because you don't really need to carbo load a huge amount on those days leading to it, as long as you're eating the right amount of macronutrients for the amount of exercise that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, if you're doing that, your glycogen stores, which is what you're achieving by eating carbohydrates, are going to be filled all the time. So, if you train the Monday, let's say you're going to do a century on Sunday, Monday you rest. Well, if you eat, the right amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and nitrates at that, your carbohydrate stores are going to be pretty full on Monday. And then on Tuesday, you're going to eat a little more because you're going to train on Tuesday. And then on Tuesday, you're going to fill it up a little more. So a little bit at a time, so you're never in a big deficit. You never
Okay.
want to be in a big deficit. And then the day before, it's always good to load a little bit. Again, depending on your goals, because if you eat like an amount of carbohydrates, like a big carbo load meal, and you're not used to doing that the night before, the next day your legs are going to feel like big blocks of wood for the first hour or two. You're going to have so much water, and so they're just going to be like filled with like and that can be snappy. And so if you really want to have, if you want to ride in the front group and you really want to go, you can't afford to like take it easy on the first hour or two and get all that water out of you, and starting to feel like you have some snap in your legs, and not just like big blocks of wood. So carbo loading is it's a process of every day you're basically carbo loading. If you're training for endurance, you're always carbo loading. you
Okay.
know
I know that you've called it something as far as training the gut. Is that really what you're describing right now, or is that something a little bit different? Like if somebody's maybe heard that before, how would you describe that, and why is that so important for a cyclist?
Yeah, in a sense, the process that I just talked about is training the gut, because if you are following the the recommendations for carbohydrates on that chart, you're going to be eating a lot of carbohydrates when you get to those 4 and 5 hour days. And a lot of those carbohydrates, you're going to have to eat them while you're riding. And so that if you follow that, you're going to train yourself to eat, and to process a lot of food while you're riding. If you don't do that, you're going to get to, the Empire State Ride or any multi-day ride, and you're going to try to eat like a lot, because the next day you got to go another 90 miles and you're going to eat more than you normally do. And chances are that you're going to have some digestive problems,
Hmm.
because you haven't trained your gut to process that many carbohydrates and that many sugars while you're exercising. And secondly, you don't really know what works for you because you haven't experimented. Some people do really good with, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Some people do well with gels. Some people don't do well with gels, and some people don't do well with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So part of training the gut is also learning, what foods actually works best for you, and so that you can ride at a decent intensity and eat at the same time, and have everything go through and digest and provide, the energy that the food is meant to provide. And so training the gut's a big deal, because once your gut shuts down, it's like no matter what you put into it, it's like you're gonna be bloated, and it's just not gonna go through. It's almost worse than not eating. You're gonna bonk because the food is not actually getting digested, but it's sitting in your stomach, creating major discomfort. So training the guts, it's important, but it's not difficult to do. All it takes is follow the recommended guidelines for eating certain amount of grams of carbohydrates while you're training, and that's a super simple thing to do. Then the only thing you have to do is figure out which form of carbohydrates works for you. So you might start with trying some bars, from your local bike shop, and if that doesn't work, you can switch bars, and you can try some gels, different combinations.
Okay.
But it's important to go through that.
I'd like to ask you about when you're getting on the bike, right? And this is kind of a continuation of nutrition. What are you doing and what do you recommend for hydration? Let's say somebody's got an 80-mile day, it's hot out. I know at least on the Empire State Ride, you had some days that got up there in mileage, but lots of hills. So you're really pushing yourself in some pretty warm, sticky days at times. What's your recommendation to people if they're not really sure how to hydrate their body properly?
Yeah, that's important, because hydration is actually more important than nutrition. There was a CTS coach once came up with this saying that I thought was brilliant. It says, nutrition doesn't work if you're not hydrated. In other words, you can eat all you want, and if you don't drink, your performance is gonna go down. And not only that, but then you're not going to be able to really break down the food and digest. So nutrition only works in a hydrated state. So hydration may be like the first point. It's like as soon as you get on your bike, start drinking. That guideline that I was telling you about, that chart, also has the hydration in there as well. How many bottles you should drink based on, distances and things like that. But generally speaking, you want to drink, let's say a 2 hour ride, not like incredibly hot, just normal summer day, not like blistering hot. A bottle an hour probably will be okay, and of those two bottles, one would be water and one would be a hydration mix that has some electrolytes in it. That's kind of a typically, sound, program to do for nutrition, for hydration. On days where you're going to be out there for 4 or 5 hours and it's blistering hot, you basically got to just be drinking all the time. It's like you could, a bottle and a half per hour would be better.
I
And
know you've explained this before, and I forget exactly what happens, but I remember you explaining like if you don't get the proper hydration, essentially it's something happening like in your stomach where your nutrients aren't being absorbed anymore or something.
yeah, not only that, but that's the first thing that's going to happen if when you start when you get dehydrated is that your muscles just stop working. All of a sudden you're going along the road at let's say 13 miles an hour, and that's a perceived rate of exertion of maybe 6 to 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, and all of a sudden it feels like an 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10, and also now you're going 10 miles an hour. That's not a fitness problem usually, especially if you're trained and you're a couple hours into the ride, or 3 hours or 4 hours into the ride. If you lose I think it's 3% of your, I have to look at the actual numbers, I can't remember, but if you lose 3% of your body weight from water loss, your performance is going to go down by a large percentage, and your day is really going to be a lot harder. So hydration is critically important. Really.
Now, I know that we've gotten questions because we've done some like Facebook Lives where people will kind of ask their questions live on the broadcast, and we'll link to that too in this description of this video, all these other resources that we keep mentioning. Some people ask about like electrolyte, pills or things that you can put in your water. Do you have any kind of recommendation or opinion on that stuff? Or
yeah, I do. I have an opinion about hydration, or what you put in your bottle for hydration should just answer the hydration question. Should have maybe a little bit of sugar in there, a little bit of carbohydrates, but generally hydration drinks should be mostly about hydration. So they'd be high in electrolytes and not very high in carbohydrates. And your carbohydrates and the main amount of your carbohydrates should come from food. And in the past, and there's still some products out there that kind of combine both, that have a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar, and a lot of electrolytes. But it seems that the general public has a hard time processing that type of drink that has everything in it. Some people can do it, and if you can do it, it's really convenient, because then all you have to do is drink. But generally, I would say the majority of people that I know of can't really do that, including myself. So, there's a lot of companies out there now that are making exercise hydration products that are primarily a hydration vehicle, not a carbohydrate, not a calorie. They're not high in calories.
okay.
So that's what I would say. Yeah, definitely go with that type of hydration product.
Another thing that I know people can kind of get hung up on, and this is kind of switching gears a little bit, is the equipment that somebody's riding for a long distance ride. So let's say, right now they just got your standard like mountain bike and they're like not even sure where they're going to go. And, one person says you need a $10,000 bike. Somebody else says, no, you don't. It's just about the hours spent on the seat. I mean, what would you tell somebody who's maybe new to this, or maybe even intermediate, who has questions on equipment when it comes to a century ride or a multi-day ride like the Empire State Ride where you're doing 500 miles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, depending on goals, but it's amazing how good of a bike you can get out there now for about $1,500, maybe even $2,000. You don't have to have a $10,000 bike to do any century or or the Empire State Ride. But I would suggest that, mountain bikes is probably not the best, thing for either one of those, unless it's a gravel type of race maybe. But if it's a road event, you want to be on, road wheels and road tires, and, a somewhat light bike, and then having the right gearing, and then probably the most important thing of it all is making sure that whatever bike you decide to ride, whether it be a hybrid bike with, flat bars, but with, road wheels, or, or time trial bike, or whatever bike you decide to ride, bike fit is number one recommendation, because how you're sitting on that bike is going to make all the difference in the world on how you perform, your comfort level, and injury prevention. So think about bike fit. That's, I would rather see somebody on $1,000 bike with a good $200 bike fit than somebody on a $5,000 bike that doesn't fit them. The person on the $1,000 bike is going to be much happier.
Wow.
I can't really express how important bike fit is. And I, every day, every year that I go, to the first day when we go to the to Wagner College and I'm sitting in the gym, a lot of people have bike fit questions for me, and we go through some kind of a really simple, easy bike fit that gets them into somewhat of a position. I'm not an expert bike fitter, and we have no tools there to do that. So it's not really the best time to do it. I would get a professional bike fit, and you can get them anywhere in the United States now. I mean, there's
Mhm.
great bike fitters everywhere.
Well, and you also brought up a good point where it's like you don't want to be changing your fit substantially the day before the ride that you're going on, because you've done all this training and you've gotten your body accustomed to one type of fit, and then all of a sudden your body's probably going to be confused if you make major adjustments.
No doubt. Absolutely. No doubt. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Okay, so kind of going off of equipment, as far as just getting your bike ready for one of these rides, is there anything that's like really important that jumps out to you? I mean, I know, of course, like you got to make sure your brakes are working, but like I know a lot of people kind of go back and forth on what they're supposed to do with their tires for pressure. What are your recommendations to somebody who's just, making sure their bike is set and ready to go for a long ride?
Let's see. Yeah, so when you talk about brakes, I would, for the Empire State ride, here's what I do, for a ride like that. I put new brake pads on. And if you have disc brakes, I would put new disc brake pads on as well. So new brake pads. I'd put a new chain on, unless you've just put a new chain on in the last couple of months or so, or a month, I'd put a new chain on. Make sure you have the right cassette. So make sure you have a good cassette for Empire State Ride, which,
So for somebody who might not be familiar, that's just the rear cogs and just making sure that you have enough of them so that you can make some of those hills easier.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
And what's a good standard for that if somebody's doing a long distance hilly ride? Would you say like, well, what kind of cassette would they be looking for?
I would do 1132, and
Okay.
that's if you have an 11 speed bike. And nowadays 1132s are really common. Bike manufacturers have like created the derailleurs that can handle that big of a gear in the back, and then with a compact crankset in the front, you almost have a 1-to-1 gear ratio. You might not use it, but a couple of times, like that finish on the third day, that is, I think it's the third day.
Frosty Acres, is it?
Yeah, it's a Frosty Acres,
Mhm.
where it's at the end of a long day, and then you have like a quarter mile or so, with a 12 to 13% pitch. That's tough.
Mhm.
And so that's when you slip it into 32, and you just go up nice and easy, and you don't have to suffer as much. So all of those things are important. The great thing about the Empire State Ride is the mechanics are awesome.
Mhm.
You got mechanics there, and they usually have some equipment there with them. But out of respect for those guys, the best thing you can do really is bring your bike clean, chains clean, everything, and they might go over your bike and make sure all the bolts are tight, and everything is okay, and the tire pressure is good, and they'll take care of that for you. But bring your bike with new brake pads, new chain, a good cassette in the back, and clean, and that'll be great. As far as tire pressure, the wider your tires, the less tire pressure you need. So nowadays, a lot of people are riding the road on 28 millimeter tires or 25, where the standard used to be 23. And 23 was, in the old days, it was considered a pretty wide tire. So at 23, if you use, let's say, 100 PSI on a 23 millimeter tire, you're probably only going to need, you know, 85 to 90 on a 25. And if you're using a 28, you only need 70 to 75 pounds per square inch on that. So it all depends on your on the width of the tire.
Okay. And I know that you've mentioned before, from a safety standpoint, if it's maybe a little bit wet out that day, you can maybe back the pressure off a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another thing I think that's worth mentioning for people that are watching this that are interested in the Empire State Ride, a lot of hills, going down hills. Safety wise, what's your recommendation to somebody as you're going down a hill and you're getting a pretty good speed? What's the most stable position?
Well, the safest position is having your hands in the drops, not on the hoods, or obviously not at the top, but in the drops itself, because your hands can't really slip off of the drops, and you have a lot more. You could have more control of your bike, but besides your hand position, you definitely want to control your speed, and not go out of your comfort zone on the speed. You can, as the week progresses, you'll get faster going downhill. And in fact, if you do the 22-week program and you ride hills and you ride them a lot, you're going to progressively get a little better at descending and feel a little more comfortable. But I always say, never try to follow somebody on a downhill that is going faster than you are comfortable with. Just let them go and meet them later or something like that. But downhill, just be conservative and feel comfortable and confident in what you're doing at that moment.
I know something that you've mentioned before too is as far as hand placement, safety wise, that you said that there should always be a certain amount of contact with your hands, and that you have seen riders in the past who maybe are riding like this, or they kind of got one hand off and they're waving. Yeah. So what's your recommendation real quick on how you can make sure that you're always being safe with your hand placement?
Yeah, one of the things that can happen in cycling, especially when you're riding for this many hours in a day, and you're looking around, you might be talking to somebody that you're riding next to, you might be admiring, some of the scenery and stuff, and you're not thinking about what you're doing. And so if you hit, some kind of an obstacle that is just going to kind of like stop the bike temporarily, not a big one, and not a crash. I'm not talking about a crash. I'm talking you hit a rock or a pothole. Your hands, unless you have your thumbs, like if you have your hands on the tops, you need to have what I call the hook. You got to have your thumbs underneath, so that if you're looking around and you're doing that and that comes up, the handlebars are going to come into your hands instead of having your hands on the top, and your hands are just going to slip off, and then you're going to crash. You're going to lose your hands. So when you're on the tops, it's best to have your thumbs underneath, and then when you're on the hoods, it's best to have your pinky kind of underneath the handlebars. So in some way you have like a hook.
It's kind of just your pinkies would be in like this, because I think yours are off the screen just barely.
Yeah. Your pinkies are kind of like underneath and grabbing like the bar. It's kind of like creating the same hook that your thumb is over the top. And the same thing, so that if you hit something, you're going to be able to hold on with your pinkies. You're going to have that reaction, versus if you're just on the top like this, you're just going to come off of the hoods. And of course, if you're in the drops, then that's an automatic hook, right? So in the drops, you can never lose your hands, from an incident like that. So always have the hook, either the pinky or the thumb.
Switching gears again. So mentally preparing for a big ride, I think that there's a few different things that we could talk about here. So I think it would make sense to start with, somebody looking at that training plan and they go, I don't know if I can do this, So I think there's that part of the mental part. And then there's the mental part of maybe as you're leaving that day for the ride, and maybe when you're getting gas towards the end. So do you want to kind of walk me through that? Maybe somebody who's looking at the training plan day one and thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to do this in 22 weeks or however far out it is?
Yeah, I mean, like, the 22-week training plan seems like, a huge undertaking. 500 miles in a week seems like almost an impossible undertaking. I mean, honestly, there's not many people who can say that they've ridden 540, by the way, 540 miles in a week, or some percentage of that. Like, let's say, you end up only riding 4 of the 540 miles. That's still huge. And that's the kind of mileage that professional cyclists at the very top level do in a week. So if you look at it, if you look at it as the whole enchilada, 22 weeks, how am I going to do that? Or 500 miles, I'm going to do that. It's going to be daunting, and it's going to be tough for you to process how you can do it, especially if you've never done it, because you don't have any evidence of being able to do it. But if you break it down, like you look at that 22-week training plan and just look at the first week, or maybe just look at the first day. All you have to do is one day at a time. And that's how you start. You just start one day at a time. And the plan starts with very little volume, very little intensity, to make it easy to comply with the frequency that is probably the most important thing about training, that, getting the frequency of getting 5 rides in a week. Sometimes you might not get 5 rides. So, you might ask yourself, how am I going to ride for 5 days for 22 weeks? Well, you might not. You might start the first week and you might get 3 or 4 rides in. That's a lot better than no rides. And then the next week you might get 5. The following you might get 2 because life gets in the way, work, family, things like that. So you just take it one day at a time and you do what you can do, and you just kind of continue on the plan. If you miss a certain amount, just go on and pick up the plan where it is on that day. So that's kind of how to approach the plan. One day at a time.
Okay.
An hour here, 2 hours here, an hour there.
Well, I know people too with a long training like this, they get a little bit nervous that they're not going to even have the time to train, right? But I think one of the things worth highlighting with your training plan, like you mentioned, especially the first 10 weeks or so, is you're doing 2 hours or less. It's not like you have to get out on the bike. Eventually, you're going to have to put more hours on the bike when you're out there. But it is something that people can still see gains if they're kind of working your training plan as it's laid out, right?
Yeah, no, you make probably the most important point in personal one-on-one coaching. The first thing a coach is going to ask you, if you hired me to be your coach, first thing I'm going to say to you, besides, we're going to talk about maybe some goals or everything, is I'm going to ask you, how many hours do you have a week to train? Some people have 5 hours a week. Some people have 10. Some people have 15. And this program assumes that everybody has X amount of hours, and that's obviously not true. And so you got to do whatever you can. You got to be part of that. I would say that, the least amount of hours that you have to train for an event like this, the more specific and the more careful you have to be about training, to really prepare for it. So that might be a better, a good cause for, having a personal coach, a one-on-one coach that can make a program that says, okay, if you only got 5 hours a week, this is the best way to use those 5 hours, to prepare for this. So that's the problem with generic training programs, is that it doesn't address those critically important issues, because, eventually on this program, you're going to be riding 8 to 10 hours a week. And I think maybe even some 12-hour weeks, and some people just don't have the time to do it. So they got to do something differently.
Okay. Moving forward, as far as kind of mental training. So the day of the ride, it's your first day going out. Maybe it's, you got a pretty good 70-mile day out ahead of you. What are you telling somebody if they're feeling nervous, or what kind of tips, or maybe what mistakes have you seen somebody have because of the way they're approaching the ride mentally?
I think that the the psychology of performance, or of achieving goals is really interesting, and you can definitely talk yourself into having a bad day, and you can talk yourself into having a great day. And here's the way that I talk to the folks doing the Empire State Ride, is that when you start in the morning, it's not a 70-mile ride. You're riding from the start to the first uh, feed zone, or food station, which generally is somewhere between 20 and 25 miles. So what you have to think about, it's kind of the same thing as the plan. Take one day at a time, except
Mhm.
on the Empire State Ride, you take one leg on each day at a time. So it's the think about the difference in thinking when you're like about to take off. Man, today I got to ride 70 miles. Right now I'm thinking I got to ride 70 miles, or I just got to get to that first feed station, 25 miles. I can get off my bike. I can drink. I can eat something, get the encouragement from anybody else, then get ready. And I got another 25-mile section. And so you break it down into small sections like that. It's not you don't have to do 70 miles without nonstop. And generally speaking, you're probably going to do harder rides in your training than you're going to do during the Empire State Ride. Because when you get to the point where you're doing 50 and 60 miles on your training program, or maybe even 70 miles or something, or 3 or 4 hours, you're probably not going to stop as much.
Mhm.
So if you're going to be prepared to be able to ride 40 or 50 miles nonstop. And then you come to the Empire State Ride, and all of a sudden you're only riding 25 miles, and you're stopping, you're replenishing, and you're socializing, and you're in no hurry. There's nothing else to do.
Mhm.
That's the beauty of these types of rides. It's like you get up in the morning, you're like, I get to ride my bike all day long,
Yeah.
and then they're going to feed me, and my place to sleep is going to be set up for me, and so when you start to think about it like that, in small pieces, it's not that daunting of a thing to do, as long as you've prepared as well as you can based on the hours that you've been able to do. And as you're riding along, those 25 miles day in and day out, those legs, that you're doing the right thing, that the intensity that you're riding is correct, the nutrition and the hydration is correct in between each speed zone. And listen, this is going to be I've done it 3 times now, and I'm amazed at some of the people who complete this ride.
Mhm.
And it's because a lot of them have great attitudes. And most of the people on this thing have great attitudes, and that will get you, your mental state will get you, through a day like that, either really easy or really hard.
Okay.
So just got to be, happy to be there, and understand the cause, why you're there, and then just have fun. And the amount of support you get on this ride is completely different than any 5-hour ride you're ever going to do by yourself on a training ride. So
Mhm.
it's going to be like the training, in a sense, it's going to be harder than the ride itself.
And what I'm going to do is, on the screen right now, I'll put a link that people can check out your coaching page at Carmichael Training Systems.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you said too that you'd be willing to talk to people if they have questions and want to reach out, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And they can find me at clivermore@trainright.com.
Okay.
And you can send me an email if you're interested in personal coaching. This is how I make my living, and I'm happy to answer a couple of questions here and there, but generally, if you're interested in personal one-on-one coaching, and you're just curious about what that is, I'm happy to talk to you about that. And I've talked to a few Empire State riders along the way last year. I remember Scott Cohen. I spoke to him for a while on the phone, I was had to hold him back, because Scott was just riding way too much. But for me, this is so enjoyable working with folks that are doing this ride, because it's a huge undertaking. The cause is unbelievable. And every year I get more and more motivated, and I want to participate more. So I'm happy to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not too often you get to have an experience with so many amazing parts to it, where it's like the cause and raising funds for cancer research, the views that you get to see, whether it's being in, middle of New York State and seeing these gorgeous rivers and hills, or you're in, seeing the Statue of Liberty, Niagara Falls. But the camaraderie was nothing like I had anticipated when I went through the ride. I mean, it's really great, and it's an amazing event to go through. So
it really is, man. I look forward to it. Yeah.
All right. Well, as I've mentioned also earlier in this video, I will have in the description of this video, there'll be resources. We do live Facebook interviews in the past, and I think we might be doing some of those in the future. So that's an opportunity too, if you join the Facebook page and join the discussion there, that Charlie can answer your questions when we're doing those. So there'll be all sorts of resources too that we'll link out to in the description.
Yeah, I think we're going to be set up for doing 3 live Facebooks, just like we did last year, and those are fun, because you get questions from people, and anything I can do to help, I'm more than happy to do it, Eric.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. I'll let you take care of yourself and get out of here, and maybe hydrate, because I'm sure you're probably riding tomorrow too. I know how you are.
All right, Eric. Take care, man. All right.
See you, Charlie.
Okay. Bye.